Imagine walking into a kitchen in the year 1850. It smells faintly of smoke, flour dust hangs in the air like a pale fog, and the big wood-burning stove is still warm from the morning's work. On the table sits a round loaf of bread, golden on the outside, soft on the inside, and it's only hours old. Tomorrow, if you aren't careful, that same loaf might be speckled with green fuzz, spotted with blue, or tinged with a sour smell that makes the whole kitchen wrinkle its nose. In 1850, bread was life. Families ate it at breakfast, lunch, and supper. It was the foundation of nearly every meal, torn apart with stew, dipped into milk, or spread with butter when butter could be spared. And because bread was so central, keeping it fresh was a daily struggle. Mold was not some rare misfortune. It was the natural enemy lurking in every kitchen corner. Unlike today, there were no plastic bags to seal in freshness, no commercial preservatives, no neat little twist ties at the top of a store-bought loaf. Bread lived openly, in a world full of drafts, smoke, insects, and damp air. So how did people fight back? That's the question we're unraveling tonight. How people kept their bread from molding in 1850. It sounds simple, but it will lead us through the heart of the 19th century kitchen, through rituals and remedies, through science and superstition, through ingenuity and inconvenience. But before we can talk about mold, we need to talk about bread itself. In 1850, bread wasn't something you simply bought at the store. In fact, for many families in rural America, the very idea of buying bread would have seemed almost embarrassing. Bread was homemade, plain and simple. It was the duty of wives, daughters, or hired girls to prepare it, usually several times a week. The flour was often coarse, milled locally, and sometimes mixed with cornmeal if wheat was scarce. Yeast wasn't neatly packaged in little cubes either. It was grown at home, cultivated from fermenting liquids, or shared between neighbors. The loaf that came out of this process was fresher, heartier, and in some ways more alive than what we know today. But that very freshness meant it was also fragile. Bread of 1850 did not last long, and mold loved it. The soft crumb, the moisture, the lack of preservatives, it was the perfect feast for spores. Families could wake up to find that yesterday's loaf had already begun its slow betrayal, its surface sprouting tiny colonies that grew bolder with each passing hour. To fight this, people developed a whole arsenal of methods. Some practical, some strange, some so desperate you almost have to laugh. They wrapped bread in cloths soaked with vinegar. They set it in stoneware jars. They tucked loaves into cool cellars. They dried slices in the oven so they could be revived later with a little hot milk. They even used potatoes, salt, and sometimes sheer wishful thinking. What's striking is not only the inventiveness of these techniques, but also what they reveal about the world of 1850. Mold wasn't just a nuisance. It was a symbol of waste, of lost labor, of food insecurity in a century when every crumb mattered. To let bread go bad was almost a moral failing, a sign of carelessness in a society where thrift and frugality were prized. Housewives kept watch over their loaves the way a shepherd guards his flock. As we drift through this story together, we'll see bread not only as food but as a thread weaving through American life. Bread was on the table at every meal, but it was also in the sermons of preachers, in the contracts of soldiers, in the rations of workers. And mold, small, silent, invisible, was the ever-present reminder that nothing, not even daily bread, lasted forever. So tonight, as we step back into that kitchen, with its fire crackling low, its shelves lined with jars, and its bread cooling in the open air, let's follow the loaf. Let's see how people tried to keep it fresh, how they failed, how they succeeded, and how every little trick against mold tells us something about who they were, and how they lived. And we'll begin, quite naturally, with the kitchen itself, where the story of bread in 1850 really begins. To understand why mold haunted every loaf, we first need to step inside the rhythm of a kitchen in 1850. Bread didn't just appear. It was coaxed into being through ritual and routine, part of the daily labor that defined the household. In most American homes, especially outside of bustling cities, the kitchen was the true heart of life. Forget parlors or bedrooms. This was the room where families gathered, where the heat of the stove fought back the cold in winter, where the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, and where a week's worth of chores began and ended. And at the center of it all was the bread-making table. Bread wasn't something a woman casually decided to make on a whim. It was planned, and it was expected. Flour had to be sifted, water fetched, and yeast nurtured like a living pet. In an age before packets of dry yeast, families relied on starter, a bubbling mass of fermented dough or liquid. Some called it emptins, made from the yeasty foam of beer or cider. Others kept a piece of yesterday's dough tucked away in a jar, waiting to be mixed into today's batch. To lose your starter was almost a catastrophe. It meant starting from scratch, begging a neighbor for a scoop, or waiting days for a new one to grow strong enough to raise a loaf. Once the ingredients were assembled, the process of kneading began. If you've ever kneaded dough yourself, you'll know it's not a dainty task. It's sweaty, rhythmic work, pressing, folding, turning over and over until the dough takes on that smooth, elastic feel. In 1850, this meant rolling up sleeves, scattering flour across the wooden table, and working the dough with hands that were already calloused from 100 other tasks. Then came the rising. Today, we set dough in a quiet corner or even in the refrigerator. But in 1850, rising dough lived at the mercy of the kitchen's climate. On cold days, it might sit sluggish and heavy, refusing to puff up. On hot, humid afternoons, it could rise too quickly, threatening to sour. Housewives tucked their dough near the warm stove, or covered it with cloths, or even set it on a sunny windowsill, hoping nature would cooperate. When it was finally ready, the dough was shaped into round or oval loaves and placed in pans or straight onto the oven's hearthstone. Here the stove itself played a starring role. The iron cookstove, by 1850, was becoming a fixture in many homes, though in rural areas the old brick bake oven still lingered. Either way, baking bread meant a delicate dance with fire. Too hot, and the crust burned before the inside had a chance to cook. Too cool, and the loaf turned out heavy, damp, and disappointing. Housewives often learned to gauge temperature not with thermometers, but with instinct, slipping a hand into the oven, watching how quickly a piece of paper browned, or judging by the hiss of spitting flour. At last, after hours of mixing, kneading, rising, and tending the oven, bread emerged. Golden, fragrant, steaming. A triumph of skill and patience. But almost immediately, the battle against mold began. The loaf didn't come out of the oven wrapped in plastic or tucked in a paper bag. It cooled in the open air, right there on the table or on a wooden board. It might be covered with a clean cloth to keep off flies and dust, but otherwise, it was naked. And the moment warm steam met cool kitchen air, the clock started ticking. Within hours, the loaf would begin losing its tender freshness. By the next day, the surface might feel firmer, the cut end drying out. And by the second or third day, if the weather was damp or the kitchen crowded with cooking steam, spots of mold could creep across the crust. Families knew this cycle well. It was one reason bread was baked so frequently. Instead of one giant loaf meant to last all week, many homes baked smaller loaves several times, keeping supply and freshness in step. In cities, bakeries operated on similar rhythms, with bread often bought daily, carried home in baskets or tucked under arms. What strikes us today is just how much labor went into a food we take for granted. Bread wasn't a product. It was a project. And its fragility, the way it seemed to betray its maker so quickly with mold, made it all the more precious. Every loaf represented hours of work, and the thought of it spoiling before it was eaten carried weight beyond simple disappointment. It meant wasted flour, wasted firewood, wasted labor. In an age when nothing was easily replaced, bread was guarded fiercely. Which is why the next part of our story, the science of spoilage and how people understood it, mattered so much. Today, we talk about bread going moldy in the language of microbiology. Spores in the air, colonies forming on damp surfaces, fungi thriving on starches. But in 1850, nobody had a microscope on their kitchen table. Most people didn't think of mold as a living thing at all. It was just there, as much a part of life as smoke in the chimney or mud on the boots. To the 19th century housewife, mold wasn't explained by germs or fungi but by vague notions of bad air and uncleanliness. The miasma theory, the belief that illness and spoilage alike came from foul, invisible vapors, was still dominant. If the air in your kitchen was damp, if it smelled sour, if it felt heavy, then bread would sour with it. Mold was thought to rise from corruption itself, as if badness simply bred more badness. And yet, even without the vocabulary of microbiology, housewives understood mold intimately. They observed it daily. They noticed how loaves spoiled faster in humid summers than in crisp winters. They knew that a drafty pantry encouraged it, or that loaves wrapped too tightly in damp cloths could sour in a single night. They may not have had scientific terms, but they had sharp eyes and long memories. Bread itself offered the perfect feast for mold. Freshly baked, it held moisture in every crumb. Unlike hardtack or ship's biscuit, those rock-hard rations designed for long storage, soft wheat loaves were moist and tender. The very qualities that made them delicious also made them vulnerable. Every slice carried a hidden invitation to the countless spores drifting invisibly through the air. Flour, too, played its part. By 1850, milling was becoming more refined, but flour often contained bits of bran, germ, or stray matter that made bread nutritious but also more perishable. Coarse flours retained natural oils that could go rancid. Cornmeal breads, beloved in the American South, were especially quick to turn sour. And then there was the kitchen environment itself. Few homes had refrigeration of any kind. Iceboxes were beginning to appear in wealthier households, filled with blocks of ice hauled from frozen rivers, but most families relied on root cellars or pantries. These cool spaces helped, but they were far from perfect. In the warmth of summer, bread spoiled faster than anyone could eat it. In the damp of spring, mold crept over loaves like ivy on a wall. Even the tools of preservation could sometimes backfire. Covering bread with a cloth kept flies away, but if the cloth was damp, or if steam hadn't fully escaped the loaf, moisture built up beneath the cover and encouraged faster molding. Storing bread in jars or crocks provided protection, but also trapped in humidity. Housewives learned to strike a careful balance. Too much air, and the bread dried to stone. Too little air, and it soured overnight. What fascinates us is that while families lacked the scientific explanation, they were practicing a kind of experimental science every day. If one loaf spoiled too quickly, they tried a different cloth, or stored it in a cooler corner, or baked a smaller batch. They compared notes with neighbors, passed along remedies, and carried the accumulated wisdom of generations. In truth, bread mold was part of a larger battle against spoilage. Kitchens in 1850 waged constant war against decay, meat that went rancid, milk that soured, butter that turned. Bread was simply one front in a broader struggle. Every meal depended on a careful dance with time, temperature, and luck. Housewives developed what we might call kitchen intuition, a sixth sense for when a loaf was safe and when it had crossed into danger. To throw away bread was no small matter. Flour was not cheap, firewood was not endless, and labor was never light. When a loaf molded, it wasn't just a loss of food, it was a blow to the pride and thrift of the household. Mold could even be a source of shame, a whispered sign of carelessness. Good housekeepers guarded their bread as fiercely as their silverware. So when we talk about the science of spoilage in 1850, we must remember, the science was not in books or lectures. It was in the kitchen itself, in the hands and eyes of those who lived the cycle daily. They may not have known about spores, but they knew mold was quick, relentless, and merciless. And they knew it required constant vigilance. Next, we'll see what that vigilance looked like. Because while the science of mold was invisible, the rituals of preservation, the wrapping, the storing, the daily checking of loaves, were very visible indeed. Bread, in 1850, was never left to its own devices. The moment a loaf came out of the oven, cooling on the table or the hearthstone, the clock began ticking. Housewives, maids, and daughters moved quickly into the next stage of care. How to make the loaf last just one more day, maybe two if fortune was kind. The most common ritual was simple covering. A fresh loaf might be draped with a clean cloth, often a piece of linen kept just for this purpose. This was not decoration, it was defense. The cloth shielded the loaf from dust, soot, flies, and the occasional wandering mouse. In homes where butter or milk was precious, bread was too important to risk a nibble from pests. And yet, the cloth was a gamble. If it clung too tightly to the warm crust, it trapped in steam, leaving the bread damp, and mold flourished. The best housekeepers learned to let the loaf breathe. Covered, yes, but never suffocated. Bread boxes, though still a novelty, were another tool. By mid-century, carpenters and tinsmiths began making containers specifically for bread storage. Wooden boxes with tight lids, tin chests lined with paper, even simple lidded baskets were employed to shield loaves from air and animals alike. Some were placed right on the kitchen counter, others tucked into pantries. Housewives often lined these boxes with cloths or newspapers, believing they absorbed excess moisture. They weren't wrong. Newspaper kept the loaf dry, though it sometimes left an inky aftertaste. Stoneware crocks and jars were also pressed into service. These sturdy vessels, already used for butter, pickles, and preserves, could hold loaves in relative coolness. In hotter months, some families even buried crocks partly in the earth floor of their cellar, hoping the chill would buy them an extra day. But again, there was a delicate balance. Too sealed, and the loaf soured. Too loose, and mold had its way. Daily inspection was another ritual. Housewives would lift the cloth, peek at the crust, and press gently with a finger. Was the loaf still springy? Did it smell sweet? Or was there that faint mustiness creeping in, the early whisper of decay? A loaf turning stale could still be salvaged, cut into toast, softened with milk, or crumbled into puddings. But a loaf with mold, that was another matter entirely. Mold was seen as corruption, not to be trifled with. The first green spot often meant the end, unless desperation forced a family to slice away the offending part and keep the rest. And make no mistake, desperation did. In poor households, nothing was wasted if it could be avoided. A loaf with just one corner speckled might be carefully trimmed, the good portion eaten quickly before more spots spread. Doctors today would shake their heads at such thrift, but in 1850, with food security always uncertain, pragmatism often beat caution. Some families timed their baking schedules around the problem of mold. Instead of one large baking day, they baked smaller loaves more often, ensuring freshness without long storage. Others leaned into the opposite strategy, baking hard, dry breads that resisted spoilage. The famous New England brown bread, steamed in tins, could last longer than its soft white cousin. Cornbread, while quick to sour, could be baked in small portions daily, its simplicity a guard against waste. For families who lived near markets or bakeries, daily purchase was another ritual. A loaf could be fetched each morning, carried home in a basket or under an arm, still warm from the oven. City dwellers came to rely on this rhythm, while rural families remained bound to their own stoves. Either way, bread was never far from someone's thoughts. Even children were recruited into the rituals. Boys sent to the cellar might be told, check the bread, and see if it's still good. Girls were taught early how to cover loaves, how to slice without wasting, how to sniff out the warning signs of spoilage. These small lessons were part of a larger education in thrift and domestic vigilance. Bread care was house care, and house care was life itself. Taken together, these daily rituals show us just how fragile food security was in 1850. There was no guarantee a loaf would survive the night, no certainty it would stretch until the next baking day. Bread was watched, guarded, tested, like a patient under constant care. Mold was a thief that could strike at any hour, and vigilance was the only defense. But people are resourceful. Beyond these routines of covering, storing, and inspecting, housewives and cooks reached for remedies more creative. Sometimes practical, sometimes peculiar, and sometimes downright strange. From vinegar cloths to potato tricks, these folk solutions form the next chapter of our tale. If the kitchen was the stage where bread was born, the pantry and the cellar were its hiding places, half fortress, half gamble, where families hoped a loaf might survive a little longer against time and air. In 1850, nearly every home had some version of these storage spaces. They weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. And bread, so quick to betray its maker with mold, was often tucked away here with all the care of a treasure. The pantry was usually a small room, often cool and shaded, tucked off the kitchen. Shelves lined its walls, holding jars of preserves, crocks of butter, sacks of flour, and sometimes smoked meats hanging from hooks. The bread had its place here too, resting on boards, or stored in boxes or baskets. The pantry had one great advantage: it was away from the heat and steam of the kitchen fire. Bread cooled faster here, stayed drier, and often kept longer than if it were left in the open. But pantries had their flaws. They were not sealed, not airtight, and certainly not free of life. Insects found their way in, drawn by the smell of flour and crumbs. Mice were frequent visitors, bold enough to gnaw through baskets or wriggle into boxes if they were not carefully shut. Housewives waged constant war with traps, cats, and vigilance, but the pantry was never entirely secure. Bread, covered with cloth or paper, was always at risk of invasion. The cellar, on the other hand, was a different world entirely. Often dug into the earth beneath the house, cellars were cool, dark, and damp. Root vegetables, barrels of cider, and salted meats thrived there. Bread, when stored carefully, could last a little longer in this chill. Housewives sometimes placed loaves in stone crocks and set them on cellar shelves, or even lowered baskets into deeper pits to escape the warmth of summer. Yet the cellar carried its own dangers. Dampness was mold's ally, and while the cool air slowed spoilage, the moisture often sped it up. Bread stored unprotected could emerge soggy, its crust softened, its heart already turning. Some families learned to line their crocks with dry cloth, or sprinkle a little salt in the bottom, hoping to absorb the worst of the moisture. Others relied on positioning, placing bread on the upper shelves, away from the damp earth floor. In wealthier households, the advent of the icebox offered a new kind of storage. Large blocks of ice, cut from frozen rivers in winter and stored in ice houses, could be delivered and placed into wooden chests lined with tin. Here, milk, butter, and even meat could last longer. Bread too could be placed inside, though it often grew hard from the cold and needed to be revived before eating. Still, in a time when every extra day mattered, the icebox was a small miracle. There was also the matter of air circulation. Pantries were sometimes built with small vents, allowing fresh air to pass through. Families noticed that bread spoiled less quickly in a space that was dry and gently ventilated, rather than one sealed too tightly. The art was in striking balance. Enough air to keep dampness at bay, but not so much that the loaf dried out into a rock. Perhaps most fascinating are the improvisations. Diaries and household guides from the mid-19th century mention women experimenting constantly with where to keep bread. Some wrapped loaves in paper and hung them from hooks, safe from mice and out of reach of damp floors. Others placed loaves inside covered milk pans, reasoning that if pans kept milk sweet, they might do the same for bread. And in summer, when all else failed, some households gave up on keeping bread at all, and simply baked daily, resigning themselves to the eternal cycle of mixing, kneading, and baking. The cellar and pantry weren't just storage, they were stages for invention. Each family had its tricks, each region its habits, and advice passed quickly between neighbors. Try salt in the crock, one woman might suggest, or a dry cloth soaked in vinegar. And the methods spread, half practical, half hopeful, against an enemy too small to see but too powerful to ignore. In the end, bread stored in a pantry or cellar was never safe for long. These spaces bought time, but they did not defeat mold. To truly fight back, families reached for remedies more direct, more creative, and sometimes more peculiar. And so we arrive at the strangest part of our tale. The folk remedies of 1850, those curious little tricks handed down through kitchens, meant to hold off mold just a little longer. When it came to bread, the battle against mold was not fought with science alone. Households in 1850 had no preservatives, no airtight packaging, no temperature-controlled storage. What they had was experience, ingenuity, and a dash of superstition. Folk remedies emerged from kitchens across the country, some practical, some peculiar, all aimed at keeping that precious loaf edible for just a little longer. One of the most common tricks involved vinegar. Housewives soaked cloths in a mild vinegar solution and draped them over loaves, believing the sour smell would repel the tiny invisible invaders. It worked, to some extent. The acidity discouraged mold growth, and the cloth created a barrier against dust and flies. Some families would even wipe the top of a loaf with a vinegar-soaked rag before covering it. To modern eyes, the smell might seem odd, but to a kitchen in 1850, it was a familiar and harmless defense. Salt was another ally in the fight. A pinch of salt sprinkled in the bottom of a bread box or crock could absorb moisture and slow spoilage. Some housewives placed loaves atop a bed of coarse salt, thinking it created a dry, protective layer. In combination with cloth covers, salt provided a surprisingly effective barrier, though it could never make bread last indefinitely. Potatoes also played a curious role. The idea was simple. A raw potato placed alongside bread in a covered container would absorb excess moisture and prevent early molding. Diaries from the period mentioned this practice with a hint of pride, as if the potato were a loyal guardian watching over the precious loaf. Families sometimes sliced the potato thin or wrapped it in cloth to avoid direct contact, fearing it might impart unwanted flavors. Bread dryers were another folk innovation. In homes where a little heat could be summoned without burning the loaf, slices were toasted lightly in the oven. This dried them, killing some mold spores and giving the bread a longer shelf life. Harder breads, like ship-style hardtack or dense brown loaves, were baked specifically to last longer. While soft white bread remained vulnerable, a few slices of hardened bread could survive a week or more, ready to be revived with milk or soaked in soup. Some remedies were more ritual than practical. In certain households, the bread was placed near herbs thought to have purifying qualities, such as rosemary or bay leaves. Others sprinkled flour or cornmeal on top of a loaf before storing it, believing the powder would act as a protective shield. These techniques combined observation with a touch of magical thinking, a recognition that mold was relentless, invisible, and almost supernatural in its swiftness. What's remarkable is how these remedies show the intersection of practicality and daily life. Kitchen manuals from the 1840s and 1850s are full of such advice. Some writers recommended vinegar, salt, or potatoes explicitly. Others suggested cleanliness, constant inspection, and rotating loaves as the ultimate safeguard. Every family learned what worked best in their own kitchen, influenced by climate, architecture, and the simple availability of ingredients. Even city dwellers engaged in these rituals. Bakers in urban areas might line their bread boxes with cloth, sprinkle salt in the bottom, or place loaves near cool windowsills. Rural families, lacking iceboxes or pantries with ventilation, relied heavily on vinegar cloths, potatoes, or daily baking cycles. In both cases, the fight against mold shaped the daily routine. Children were also enlisted in these small acts of vigilance. Boys and girls learned early how to handle loaves carefully, check for early signs of spoilage, and use the folk remedies passed down from mothers and grandmothers. It was an education in observation, patience, and resourcefulness, as much a part of growing up as sweeping the floor or fetching water from the well. These remedies remind us that bread in 1850 was more than food. It was a project, a responsibility, and sometimes a source of anxiety. Mold wasn't just a nuisance, it was a reminder of scarcity, a challenge to ingenuity, and a subtle measure of domestic skill. Housewives who could keep bread edible longer than their neighbors earned respect and quiet admiration. And while modern kitchens have rendered these rituals mostly obsolete, in 1850, they were the difference between wasted flour and a full stomach. Next, we'll step outside the family kitchen and into the public sphere, the boarding houses, inns, and taverns where bread had to survive in less controlled conditions, often for multiple households at a time. The strategies there were different, sometimes riskier, but equally fascinating. While home kitchens waged constant war against mold, the battle in boarding houses, inns, and taverns was entirely different. Here, bread was no longer a personal project. It was part of a communal system, shared among strangers, and subject to the chaotic rhythms of public life. The stakes were high. Spoiled bread could upset dozens of guests, ruin a meal, or damage a proprietor's reputation. Boarding houses were common in towns and cities, especially for travelers, laborious, or apprentices. These establishments provided meals alongside rooms, and bread was the centerpiece of nearly every meal. But there were challenges that a single household never faced. Loaves had to last longer, sometimes through multiple sittings. Kitchens were busier, with smoke, dust, and a rotating cast of diners, and the people in charge often had to juggle cost, convenience, and spoilage. Taverns faced similar pressures. Inns and taverns were the social hubs of 19th century America. Patrons came for food, drink, and conversation, often in the evenings, and the bread baked that morning might need to survive until the next batch could be prepared. Taverns relied on larger loaves, baked in bulk, sometimes a day or two ahead of time. These loaves were more likely to be wrapped in cloths or stored in wooden bins. But even so, the humidity from crowded rooms, open beer barrels, and smoky fires encouraged mold to grow. To combat this, proprietors adapted techniques borrowed from home kitchens, but on a larger scale. Loaves might be stacked in racks that allowed airflow, lined with clean linen, or placed in stoneware containers for added protection. Some inns maintained cool pantries or basements specifically for bread, sometimes using ventilation shafts to keep air moving and reduce humidity. Others experimented with sprinkling salt or flour over loaves, a nod to the folk remedies they knew from their mothers' kitchens. Daily inspection became a communal affair. Staff were trained to check loaves for early signs of spoilage, trim off anything questionable, and rotate older bread to the front while pushing newer loaves to the back. Guests themselves sometimes acted as unwitting inspectors. Complaints about mold or staleness were taken seriously, since a single bad loaf could tarnish a tavern's reputation. Despite these precautions, bread in boarding houses and taverns was often stale. The nature of communal meals meant that loaves might sit partially eaten for hours. Leftovers were sometimes repurposed into puddings, soups, or toasted slices for breakfast. No piece was wasted, and ingenuity ruled the day. Stale bread might be soaked in milk to make porridge, fried in butter to make a simple dessert, or used to thicken stews. In this way, mold and staleness shaped not only preservation techniques but also recipes and eating habits. Some inns turned to harder breads, like brown or rye varieties, which naturally resisted spoilage longer than soft white loaves. Others baked in smaller batches more frequently, adjusting schedules to match guest turnover. Bread was managed as carefully as any other ingredient, and in a sense, these establishments became laboratories of preservation, testing methods on a scale that a single household could never achieve. Interestingly, boarding houses also reflected the social hierarchy of bread. Wealthier patrons might receive the freshest, softest loaves, while laborious or long-term boarders were served the older, firmer bread. The struggle against mold, then, was intertwined with class and economy. Bread spoilage wasn't just a culinary issue. It was also a question of fairness, reputation, and resource management. What emerges from these communal kitchens is a vivid picture of bread as both sustenance and responsibility. Unlike the private rituals of home kitchens, where every loaf was watched with intimate care, the public kitchens had to balance quantity with quality. Mold was a constant adversary, and every loaf saved or repurposed demonstrated clever management, foresight, and, sometimes, a little luck. Next, we'll explore hardtack and longevity breads, the ultimate solution for situations where bread needed to last for weeks or months, a contrast to the perishable loaves of homes and inns, and a glimpse into the extremes of preservation in 19th century America. While most households and inns struggled with mold-prone soft loaves, there existed a different breed of bread designed for endurance, hardtack, or ship's biscuit, as sailors often called it, and other longevity breads. These were not meant to be soft, fragrant, or immediately appetizing. Their purpose was survival. Hardtack was simple, almost brutally so: flour, water, and salt. Sometimes it was baked twice, producing a dense, rock-hard slab that could last weeks or even months if kept dry. Unlike the tender home loaves that invited mold, hardtack was inhospitable to fungal growth. Its low moisture content and sturdy crust made it nearly impervious, a staple for soldiers, sailors, and pioneers who could not rely on daily baking. During the mid-19th century, hardtack became especially important in the military and maritime world. Soldiers marching off to war, or sailors crossing the Atlantic, needed rations that could survive long journeys. Moldy bread was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Hardtack provided a reliable source of calories, even if it required some ingenuity to eat. People learned to soak it in water, coffee, or soup to soften it before consumption. In some cases, it was crumbled into porridge, creating a practical, if not delicious, meal. Longevity breads were not confined to military life. Rural households, especially in regions with long winters, sometimes baked dense, dry loaves intended to last for days or even a week. These breads sacrificed softness for shelf life, often using whole grain flour or adding extra salt to deter mold. Bakers experimented with different shapes, thicknesses, and even drying techniques to maximize durability. One historical guide recommended baking loaves slowly, then letting them cool in the oven with the door ajar, a method that reduced moisture while keeping the crust intact. The contrast between soft, home-baked bread and hardtack is striking. In one scenario, bread is tender, fragrant, and vulnerable. In the other, it is rigid, nearly indestructible, and deliberately flavorless. Both represent responses to mold and spoilage, but they serve different needs. Families at home sought comfort and nourishment. Travelers and soldiers sought endurance above all. Yet in both cases, careful planning and preparation determined success. Hardtack also shaped culture and daily routines. Soldiers often traded it, softened it with alcohol, or transformed it into simple cakes or stews. Sailors painted it with syrup or molasses to make it edible. Even at home, longevity breads were incorporated into puddings, stews, or toasted breakfasts, ensuring that no crumb went to waste. These practices illustrate the practical creativity that permeated daily life in 1850. Interestingly, the strategies used for hardtack sometimes inspired domestic innovations. Housewives who needed bread to last a few extra days for a busy week adopted similar methods, baking slightly longer, reducing moisture, or storing in dry, ventilated containers. The boundaries between military, maritime, and domestic knowledge were porous. Practical solutions traveled easily, adapted to new contexts. By understanding hardtack and longevity bread, we see the extremes of preservation. Mold was not just an inconvenience, it dictated choices, shaped diets, and influenced routines. Whether soft loaves or rock-hard biscuits, the fight against spoilage defined what people ate, how they baked, and how they managed their kitchens. Next, we'll look at the social side of bread, how families used stale bread creatively, how sharing and thrift shaped meals, and what this tells us about the culture of 19th century American life. Bread was not merely food, it was a medium of ingenuity, economy, and human connection. Bread in 1850 was not just sustenance, it was a symbol of economy, thrift, and social connection. When a loaf went stale or showed the first signs of mold, families didn't simply throw it away. Instead, they found creative ways to repurpose it, ensuring no crumb went to waste. These practices reveal not only practical ingenuity but also a cultural mindset where food, labor, and community were deeply intertwined. One of the most common uses for stale bread was in puddings. Recipes from mid-19th century cookbooks show that day-old or slightly hardened loaves were ideal for bread pudding. Milk, eggs, sugar, and perhaps raisins transformed tough slices into a warm, comforting dish. In some households, puddings were a daily treat. In others, they were a way to stretch resources during lean weeks. Moldy spots were carefully trimmed away before cooking, and the remaining loaf was soaked and baked until soft, sweet, and aromatic. Soup and porridge also benefited from stale bread. Thickened with crumbs, these dishes could feed more mouths while stretching limited ingredients. In a rural home or a boarding house, adding bread to a pot of vegetables or meat was a practical solution. It absorbed flavors, added substance, and prevented waste. Even sailors and soldiers softened hardtack in broths to achieve the same effect. Bread, in this way, was as much a textural tool as a source of calories. Sharing bread was another important social practice. In small towns, neighbors might swap loaves, passing on surplus or older bread in exchange for other goods. A loaf that was a day or two old might be given to a friend, a neighbor, or a child who helped with chores. This informal economy created bonds and ensured that bread remained a communal resource rather than a personal loss. In some households, bread had ceremonial or symbolic significance. Certain loaves were reserved for holidays, religious observances, or Sunday meals. The freshness of these loaves mattered, and the household's attention to preventing mold was part of demonstrating care and hospitality. A moldy loaf at the wrong time could be embarrassing, a subtle failure of domestic skill or social awareness. Even the smallest details mattered. Housewives would sometimes slice bread with care, giving thinner portions to children or thicker ones to adults. Leftover crusts might be toasted for breakfast or lunch, while soft interior slices were saved for immediate consumption. Families learned to manage not only the life of the loaf but also the flow of meals. Bread determined when and how meals were served, and the vigilance against spoilage shaped the rhythm of daily life. The social dimension of bread extended to children as well. Boys and girls learned early how to handle loaves carefully, how to store them, and how to recognize the first signs of mold. In doing so, they absorbed lessons in responsibility, observation, and the practical realities of household management. Bread care was a rite of passage, a hands-on education in domestic life. Public institutions, too, reflected these social dynamics. Churches, schools, and community gatherings often featured bread as part of shared meals. Bread might be baked in larger loaves for these events and monitored closely to avoid waste. Moldy sections were trimmed, older loaves repurposed, and sharing ensured that no food was lost. In this way, even spoiled bread contributed to the cohesion and rhythm of communal life. Ultimately, the story of bread in 1850 is not only about food preservation. It's about the intersection of survival, resourcefulness, and human connection. Every loaf carried the labor of its makers, the vigilance of its guardians, and the creativity of those who repurposed it. Mold, far from being a trivial nuisance, shaped habits, meals, and social norms. It taught families economy, patience, and innovation. Next, we'll explore Section 10, Lessons from the Loaf, the enduring wisdom these 19th century practices offer us today about food, care, and ingenuity in daily life. Looking back at the kitchens, pantries, and taverns of 1850, it's easy to see bread as more than a simple staple. It was a measure of diligence, creativity, and daily intelligence. Every loaf carried with it lessons that are surprisingly relevant, even in our modern world of supermarkets and preservatives. First, bread teaches vigilance and attention. Housewives in 1850 observed loaves constantly, checking for early signs of mold, rotating supplies, trimming crusts, and adjusting storage methods. This constant observation was not obsessive but practical. A single misstep could mean waste, hunger, or lost labor. In contemporary terms, it reminds us that even the simplest resources require care. The discipline of watching, noting, and adjusting can be applied to finances, health, or personal projects. Second, bread demonstrates resourcefulness. When a loaf went stale or showed the faintest sign of mold, families didn't discard it immediately. They soaked it in milk, baked it into puddings, thickened soups, or crumbled it into porridge. Creativity allowed them to stretch resources and find value where others might see loss. This adaptability, turning setbacks into opportunities, is a timeless lesson, illustrating how constraints can spark innovation. Third, bread embodies community and sharing. Stale loaves were often shared with neighbors, children, or boarding house guests. Even in scarcity, families extended resources, creating bonds through the simple act of giving. In today's world, this reminds us that stewardship of resources is intertwined with social responsibility. How we manage our possessions, knowledge, or time can foster connection and trust. Fourth, bread illustrates experimentation and learning by doing. Folk remedies, vinegar cloths, salt, potatoes, emerged from trial, error, and observation. Housewives tracked what worked and what didn't, refining methods over time. There was no formal science involved, but the results were tangible. In modern terms, this teaches the value of experimentation, of testing solutions and learning from outcomes without fear of failure. Fifth, bread reminds us of patience and timing. Yeast needed hours to ferment, dough needed proper rising, baking demanded careful heat control. Preservation required waiting for loaves to cool, for cloths to dry, and for storage spaces to achieve the right balance of air and humidity. In our fast-paced age, these slow rhythms offer a subtle lesson. Patience, observation, and timing often make the difference between success and waste. Finally, bread reflects humility and respect for labor. In 1850, flour was costly, firewood was valuable, and every loaf represented hours of work. Mold was a formidable adversary, and losing bread was more than a culinary inconvenience. It was a tangible reminder of effort expended. Recognizing the value embedded in ordinary tasks fosters mindfulness, gratitude, and care for what we have, even in our modern abundance. There is also a quiet beauty in the rituals themselves. Covering loaves with linen, lining boxes with cloth, trimming moldy edges, and rotating supplies. These acts were small, repetitive, and intimate. They connected people to daily life in a tangible way, grounding them in the rhythms of sustenance, skill, and responsibility. There is a timeless appeal to this connection, a reminder that even mundane tasks can be meaningful when approached thoughtfully. Perhaps the most important lesson is the balance between vigilance and creativity. Mold could not be entirely defeated, and no method guaranteed success. Families learned to accept imperfection while striving for care. They combined observation, folk remedies, timing, and repurposing to navigate uncertainty. Bread, then, was a teacher. It demonstrated that effort, ingenuity, and adaptability matter, even when outcomes are never entirely certain. As we close our exploration of bread in 1850, we see more than a struggle against mold. We see daily life shaped by observation, resourcefulness, and community. We see lessons in patience, creativity, and the respect for labor. And we see the small, quiet triumphs of households who kept their loaves edible, nourishing their families one careful step at a time. In the end, the story of bread is a story of human ingenuity meeting natural limits. Mold may have won battles, but people found ways to win the war. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy of practical wisdom that continues to resonate, reminding us that even the simplest daily tasks can teach profound lessons about care, effort, and resilience.